Whiskey Rebellion, one of the biggest tests of George Washington's presidency. It's kind of an interesting event, so let's just jump right in here.
What was considered the biggest test of George Washington's presidency?
Just jump right in here to what exactly happened. All right, so the Whiskey Rebellion, primarily focused there in western Pennsylvania, was really the result of, I guess we got to go back to the American Revolution. You got to think about the American Revolution, which had ended in 1783, had left the United States in a lot of debt. All right, and
what does it mean when he says the American Revolution had left the United States in a lot of debt?
The debt had fallen primarily on the individual states. Well, in 1790, the Secretary of the Treasury, of course, Alexander Hamilton, under Washington's new cabinet, suggested that the federal government take on those debts instead of the states taking it. And he said the way that they could help pay for it was to tax whiskey. Well, George Washington,
Secretary of Treasury blank believed the government could pay off the state's part of the debts if Congress taxed which product?
George Washington, he was actually against this, but if you remember, George Washington had gone on this big tour of all the states when he was president. And during this tour, a lot of the local government officials said, yeah, they were in favor of this whiskey tax. And so he came back to New York City, where the capital was, and assured Congress that this was a good thing. And so Congress passed this tax. Well, of course, immediately people start protesting.
Why did President Washington believe Congress should pass a whiskey tax?
Are protesting against it. One of the big reasons why they protested against it was a lot of people saw this as something that hurt small farmers, because the tax, basically the way it worked, the more you produce, the more whiskey you produce, the less tax you would pay. All right, and so the bigger producers were getting tax cuts or tax breaks the more they made, while the small producers were, losing money. All right, and so these protests began immediately.
Why did many people feel, that's supposed to be many people feel, the government was using the whiskey tax to cheat them?
Protests begin immediately, and honestly, these protests look a whole lot like the protests we saw during the time period leading up to the American Revolution. Tax collectors begin to get attacked and tarred and feathered, as you can see in this picture here. So, beginning, I think the first one is recorded in 1791 of a tax collector getting attacked. Then another tax collector in 1793, his home gets attacked by a group of angry protesters. And so this goes on for, a couple of years, honestly, where, tax collectors are basically being harassed here in Pennsylvania because of this tax. But probably, one of the biggest incidents that happens in Allegheny.
What is one way people protested the whiskey tax that seemed just like the pre-Revolutionary War protests?
Happens in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, at the home of a guy named John Neville. John Neville was a tax collector and also a wealthy landowner. But on July 17th of 1794, about 700 men marched to his house and basically demanded he be brought out. Well, it just so happened that actually there were some federal troops that were there under the command of Major James Kirkpatrick. Him and about 10 soldiers were protecting the property, and actually had helped Neville escape earlier in the night to go hide basically out in the forest. But Kirkpatrick and his
How many men marched to this tax collector's home that was protected by about blank federal soldiers?
Kirkpatrick and his men basically said, you guys are not coming in the house and everything. The mob ends up setting fire to the house. They have a exchange of gunfire between these men and everything. Actually, in the end, the leader of the mob, a guy named James McFarland, ends up getting killed in this fight. All right, and so this was a big event there in July of 1794. Then a group of about 7,000 rebels come together and they threaten to march on Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, also there in July of 1794. So now George Washington has to do something.
Why did George Washington feel he had to do something about the Whiskey Rebellion?
Something. All right, so George Washington, basically at the advisement of Alexander Hamilton, had sent a peace envoy or some delegates or some guys to go out and meet with the mob and try to peacefully get them to disperse. Well, they didn't, of course, as you saw there in July of 1794. They began to attack, houses and everything. And so George Washington decides really his only option is to basically use his power as commander in chief and begins to assemble a militia. So in October of 1794, George Washington gets about a 12,000 man militia formed from Pennsylvania and from surrounding states, and he marches out with this militia. He's actually the only president in history to lead military troops out into the field. All right, and so
After an attempt to make peace did not work, how did George Washington decide to end this rebellion?
all right, and so when he gets into the area of Western Pennsylvania, of course, there's some very upset citizens, but honestly, not a whole lot of violence or anything. Actually, when Washington arrives, basically the rebels kind of say, "Okay, we're going to back down." All right, and so basically he calms this protest by marching out with his militia there in 1794. Now, the whole thing was.
What was the result of Washington's army marching into Pennsylvania?
The whole thing wasn't over yet, but I suppose for Washington's part, that was his way of dealing with it. In the aftermath, the tax is actually repealed eventually in 1802. Yes, in 1802, when Thomas Jefferson becomes president. We'll talk about Thomas Jefferson, how he was a very laid-back president and felt like the federal government should not have policies like this. But again, it gets repealed a few years later. Also, it was almost impossible for them to collect the tax. But I guess the big outcome of
The whiskey tax was eventually repealed. Which one is not a reason Congress got rid of the tax? Which one is not a reason?
big outcome of the Whiskey Rebellion is it was the first time that we really saw how the federal government was going to take power or basically flex its muscles to say we're the ones that have the authority over the states. All right, and this is going to be something that'll even lead up to the Civil War. Will be the issue of who's in control, the federal government or the states. All right, so hopefully you learned something there.
What is the big takeaway from the Whiskey Rebellion?
So hopefully you learned something there, and thanks for watching.
The major focus of the Whiskey Rebellion video you just watched was about the... Which of those two answers is correct?